This is Sam, and here's how it is. So what has this election shown us? I'm not sure what lesson conservatives may have taken from it, if any lessons at all, from this election or any other for that matter. Conservatives have lost the popular vote in 8 of the last presidential elections. That's pretty significant. But when it comes to learning things from those losses, where learning things is not something one often hears on conservative media or conservative circles as an ideal. Learning seems to be represented as an elitist thing to do. But Democrats have certainly been talking about lessons learned from this. What lessons do you all take from this? In watching Trump rallies, it's hard to see how any other lesson can be taken from this election, but to assume that a sizable portion of our precious fellow Americans are most appealed to through racism, violence, xenophobia, superstition, and basically harming others. Harming others seems to be, in their eyes, the greatest goal or accomplishment, or perhaps just for fun. This sounds crazy to say out loud, even to me, but it's difficult to see how there can be any other conclusion. Take any Trump rally. The entire rally is centered around criticizing fellow Americans, denigrating other human beings, and the greatest, loudest cheers are for the comments centered around fantasizing about causing harm to others. Whether it's locking people up or telling policemen to rough up suspects. The fact that these are the most attractive comments at rallies does not reflect well on conservatives who continue to demand empathy and greater understanding from progressives. I'm going to stop right there and study for a moment the term conservative. If progressive is synonymous with liberal ideology, then it stands to reason that regressive is synonymous with conservative ideology. From here on, I will use those terms interchangeably. So demanding empathy from others is rich, when empathy seems to be the primary missing ingredient in conservatism or regressivism. In fact, the greatest complaint repeated by conservatives on the airways and in person has been their sense of their rights being infringed upon, their right to kill fellow Americans nearly on a daily basis with mass shootings for Second Amendment appeasement, their right to torture fellow human beings by tearing Mexican families apart and caging children, their right to discriminate with an array of racial, LGBT, women's issues, and human rights issues, with demands for the world to hear and understand the painful loss of these quote-unquote rights that they felt they had and that they felt entitled to. They demand for the world to hear and understand the painful loss of these rights. Why? Is life just less interesting without these quote-unquote rights? I have yet to meet a regressive who is able to logically explain conservative policies and how those policies will help every American or even make the world more peaceful. And for conservatives who argued that there was once a better conservatism and who pine for the days of Reagan, it's hard to believe their altruism either. Just last year, when the recordings were released of Reagan and Nixon laughing about how black representatives at the UN were like animals that shouldn't be wearing shoes, some conservatives out there feigned decency and seemed shocked. The rest of us, on the other hand, were not in the least bit shocked. Of course Reagan and Nixon believed these things. Of course their supporters believed these things. And of course those beliefs of white supremacy shaped every policy decision from redlining and Jim Crow on up. The only difference with Trump is that he says these things out loud. And that seemed to have elicited great enthusiasm among all the regressive supporters who for decades felt that their white supremacist beliefs had to be said only in private and had to be repressed in public, that their discrimination was being discriminated against. They have felt victimized and discriminated against for not being able to express the harm that they wished upon others or to act upon it. In other words, they felt so wounded that their discriminatory beliefs were being discriminated against. I'm not making this up. A conservative close to me said those words. Trumpism seemed to represent a great relief, a catharsis, where conservatives finally felt that they were accepted, that they could release their bottled-up cruelty and racism that had not been socially acceptable for decades. This is what dangerous leadership does. FYI, there will always be a segment of any human population that has discriminatory leanings. This is precisely why steady, intelligent, and unifying leadership is always a necessity. With this latent white supremacy, is it any wonder that the uniform for conservatism involves a lot of hair bleach, a lot of weapons, convoluted conspiracy theories, and elaborate superstitions, in an attempt to justify their longings for racism and a return to social order where everyone had to clean them, feed them, build for them, earn for them, flatter them, comfort them, nurse them back to health, fight wars for them? They enjoyed a cushy, entitled life of just feeling important. Very Trump-like. On some level, on a purely primitive human level, it makes perfect sense. Imagine being born in a world where just the simplest physical features entitled one to a lifetime of service and privilege from others. It must be devastating to face a world in which merit might actually be required, and where the populations who were once seen as being born simply to provide service and comfort to the privileged ones are now suddenly peers and competitors. Understandably, these must be very difficult changes to accept. Imagine a spoiled child always having been served, now being told that he or she must serve themselves, or maybe even serve others sometimes. A tantrum in this situation is not a surprising response. The entire world order must seem far less convenient than before. Suddenly, the people who feel their privilege diminishing might rebel, might threaten violence, which is exactly what we have seen over these last 4 tumultuous years. So when empathetic progressives get on TV and say that we need to try to understand the regressives better and empathize with their positions and reach out to them and help them address the quote-unquote issues that matter to them, it seems the main issue is lack of education, lack of empathy, and lack of proper mental health. But on the part of the regressives, how does one even begin to address that with a population who insists that learning new things is elitist? Furthermore, if learning new things like empathy risks putting them on equal footing with everyone else, how can the world be expected to continue comforting, consoling, humoring, and empathizing with these behaviors and belief systems? Forgiveness requires some effort of reformation. Until we see some effort of reform, forgiveness and empathy do not seem well earned. With scores of white supremacist groups supporting regressive policies, is it any wonder that charges of racism still plague the party? Occasionally, one meets a red-faced conservative screaming racist propaganda while using their relationships to people of color as some sort of shield against accusations of racism. But what's really happening? What's happening in those moments is that these lonely, insecure white folks, who hold other white people in such high regard that they feel unworthy of white companionship. These are insecure, racist white folks who scream racist propaganda while marrying people of color and producing children of color. Because by surrounding themselves with people who they believe are inferior to them, they can assuage their insecurities. In these cases, having relatives of color does not form a defense against racism. It is only a further indictment of their racism and insecurity. I know whereof I speak. Racism hurts everyone. It ruins lives, takes lives, and holds our nation back from its fullest potential. Racism is as old as the hills. Even chimpanzees, our closest genetic relative, express illogical, violent, racist tribalism against other chimpanzees in a neighboring tree. It's a weird, animalistic, territorial, primitive behavior. And the racism that continues today just shows that not everyone has shaken this primitive behavior. Ironically, while American patriots from what was known as the Greatest Generation defeated Nazism, many of their children of the baby boomer generation are now bringing Nazism right here to the US, as can be seen with the Alex Jones rally in Arizona, polling place recently on November 6th shouting "We are Nazis," and in 2017 at the Charlottesville Nazi rally. In fact, after the Charlottesville rally, I tried listening to KKK radio. I tried reading the KKK chats and the QAnon chats. I tried to be empathetic and to understand, to listen. They all sounded eerily similar to Fox News. With one's eyes closed, it would be very easy to mistake one for the other. They are virtually indistinguishable. The convoluted efforts to justify white supremacy contaminated every discussion. It seems the first real issue to tackle that might help us come together is the pervasive disinformation. Bipartisan progress was happening at a much better rate when quote-unquote news, what we consider news, had very strict journalistic standards under US law. The lobbying by Rupert Murdoch helped secure changes to those laws in the 80s and 90s under Reagan and then George W. Bush's administration, and that's what made Fox News possible today, blurring the lines between opinion and news, or conspiracy theory and news. In fact, one of the first orders of business for a Biden administration needs to be reinstating these journalistic standards, primarily the fairness doctrine that required that both sides of a policy issue be given equal representation and equal time when being discussed in the media, and the rules that restricted companies from owning both a newspaper and a TV or radio station in the same market to reduce the monopolization of the media. News must no longer be allowed to include opinion, untruths, or conspiracies. If regressive audiences are upset about that, missing their old entertainment venue, then they can instead tune in to exciting fictional stories, sports games, or even right here to Here's How It Is. I'm Sam. Keep listening and learning.